So that gives you a way to be able to query your Exchange database. It has a limit of 25,000 mailboxes at a time that you can search, which, frankly, for most people, that'll be plenty. So you put in the search criteria, and the results go into something called a discovery mailbox, which is like a regular mailbox, except that it has some different permissions on it. And one thing I want to call out, because I think this is really one of the areas where Microsoft has made a big leap forward that a lot of people don't realize. Because of the way that role-based access control, or RBAC, works, then you can assign permissions to do a search to somebody who doesn't have any other permissions on the Exchange organization. So I can give my organization's general counsel or their HR department or some other group of people that I don't want touching my email server. I can give them a web-based way to do these searches and give them permissions to do the searches and see the results. And in fact, you can actually break it up so that one group has the ability to do the searches and a completely different group has the ability to see the results, but they don't cross. That's really powerful, because one of the big objections that people have to e-discovery implementation is saying, well, I'm worried. I don't want any one person to be able to see all this confidential or sensitive data. Now, I don't want to get into the complexity of how you make sure that your administrators are trustworthy and how you verify that they're only doing what they're supposed to do and whatnot, but being able to break things up in that way definitely makes it easier. Because that way the people who are supposed to be doing the searches can do the searches without dragging the administrators into it. And as an administrator, I really appreciate that. I don't want to be searching people's mailboxes to find out who was sending porn or who was stealing from the company or whatever the investigation or subpoena covers. I would really prefer to be as far away from that as possible. And it's nice to have that degree of separation built into the product. So for multi-mailbox search, that sort of covers the execution of a discovery request, but there's some other areas that touch on that we probably should also talk about. One you mentioned a minute ago is the ability to have retention policies. Now, those are pretty complicated. We're not going to spend much time talking about those here, but it might be helpful if you can just summarize real briefly what those are for, what they do, and how they play into e-discovery.
Right. Well, retention policies have been used for quite a while for more or less storage purposes, that people had large mailboxes and they couldn't support them on their systems. Storage has become relatively cheap, and the reason for using retention policy for storage reasons has really decreased. However, as that has decreased, what we've seen is an increase in the number. In fact, is a requirement. I mentioned before the safe harbor requirement. You need to have good faith business processes, which means your business process is a retention policy. You have to define in writing how long you're going to keep data, and you have to have an active, auditable way of actually doing that. So the retention policy is basically saying, okay, I'm going to archive my email after a year, and then we're going to keep it for another year after that. Each organization has a different type of retention policies. Some organizations, law firms themselves, for example, are just as subject to discovery concerns as anybody else. They tend to keep their data a lot longer because their business process is very much tied in their sort of file system / Exchange server. They end up using it as like a giant file archive. So they may have a different, because their business processes dictate that. So what you have to do is you have to tailor your retention policy to your organization. But you really should have one, though, because if you don't have absent a retention policy, everything is discoverable. You're liable for all the data in your system.
So that's a really good point. I remember a couple of years ago there was some flap in the news because Intel apparently, or Andy Grove, who I think either still was or had just left Intel's CEO position, basically said that Intel's retention policy was going to be to retain nothing, and that they were going to have a very short time horizon after which they would delete everything, because if that's your standard business process, then only data within that window is discoverable. Now, obviously, if you do that, you're putting a ball and chain, or you're handcuffing yourself, because there might be really good business reasons to keep data for 6 months or 12 months or whatever. And if you have a blanket rule that says it's got to go after, say, 4 months, you may be throwing away stuff that's valuable.
Yeah, and the irony is as well, it's always a balance, because on the other side of a retention policy is litigation hold policy.
Right.
And litigation hold, basically, once you even suspect litigation is taking place, you terminate an employee, you're suspecting that something's going to come back. And definitely when you get a subpoena, definitely when you start those meet and confer sessions, you have to retain the data that you have. You can no longer delete it. You're no longer in the safe harbor. You're actually outside of it. And the FRCP is very clear about you cannot modify your data. You have to have it in a secure place. So you need to have a policy that says not only, okay, this is your retention policy, but how do we stop retention policy on certain custodians as well? So they go hand in hand with each other.